A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was looking at the latest polling numbers this morning, and it hit me that we are living through a statistical earthquake. For decades, there were certain constants in American life. You could count on the sun rising in the east, the tax deadline being in April, and the American public being overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. But as of March 6th, 2026, the ground has not just shifted, it has completely cracked open.
It really has, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time, and you are right to call it an earthquake. Our housemate Daniel actually flagged this for us earlier in the week, pointing out some of the specific data from the Pew Research Center and Gallup that just came out in February and early March of 2026. It is not just a minor dip or a fluctuation we are seeing. We are looking at a fundamental decoupling of the American public from a geopolitical stance that has been a cornerstone of United States foreign policy since 1948. For the first time in the history of modern polling, the majority of Americans under the age of 55 now hold an unfavorable view of Israel.
And we picked this topic today because it feels like we have reached a point of no return for a specific demographic. When you look at the Gallup numbers from just a few weeks ago, for the first time in the history of their tracking, American sympathy is essentially at parity. 41% of Americans say they sympathize more with the Palestinians, while 36% say they sympathize with the Israelis. That is a massive reversal from just a few years ago when Israel held a consistent double-digit lead. But the real story is in that under 55 demographic. This is the opinion gap we need to talk about today. The growing chasm between government-level diplomatic support and grassroots public sentiment.
It is a study in the collapse of traditional media gatekeeping. If you look at the Pew data from 2025 and the new Gallup update from 2026, a majority of Americans under the age of 55 now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. Specifically, among those aged 18 to 34, sympathy for Palestinians is now at 53%, while sympathy for Israelis has cratered to 23%. But even more shocking to me was the middle-aged cohort, the 35 to 54-year-olds. They have flipped too. 46% now side with the Palestinians versus 28% for Israel. This suggests that the pro-Israel consensus is no longer a default setting for anyone born after the mid-1970s.
That is the part that really caught my eye. We have spent years talking about the campus protests and the Gen Z shift, but seeing that 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds are moving in that same direction suggests this is not just a youthful phase or a rebellious college trend. It is a structural shift in how the conflict is perceived and, more importantly, how information about the conflict is consumed. So today, we are going to dive deep into why this is happening. We will look at the information ecosystem, the rise of intersectional politics in the West, and then broaden the lens to see how the rest of the world is reacting, because the picture in Europe and the global South is even more stark.
We will also look for some pockets of optimism, because it is not all downhill for the Israeli narrative. There are regions and specific diplomatic efforts, particularly in the Middle East itself and parts of Africa, that actually show a trend in the opposite direction. But let us start with the domestic front. Corn, why do you think the traditional strategic ally narrative is failing so badly with people who are now in the prime of their professional and political lives?
I think it comes down to a total collapse of the legacy media gatekeepers. If you are over 65, you likely grew up with a version of Israel that was the underdog, the David fighting the Goliath of the surrounding Arab states in 1967 and 1973. You saw Israel through the lens of the Cold War as a democratic bulwark against Soviet-backed regimes. But if you are under 55, your formative memories of Israel are very different. You do not see a scrappy underdog. You see a high-tech military power, and you see the conflict through the lens of your smartphone.
You're touching on the information ecosystem, which I think is the single biggest driver here. In the past, if there was a conflict in Gaza or the West Bank, the average American saw it through a 3-minute package on the nightly news or a front page story in the New York Times. Those outlets provided what they called context, which often included the strategic necessity or the historical background. But today, a 30-year-old is getting their news from TikTok, Instagram Reels, or X. On those platforms, the strategic ally argument is invisible.
Right. And those platforms do not do context. They do visceral, raw emotion. When an algorithm is designed to maximize engagement, it is going to prioritize the most shocking, heart-wrenching footage it can find. And in a conflict like this, that almost always means images of civilian suffering. When you see a 30-second clip of a destroyed apartment building or a crying child, no amount of white papers on security dilemmas or the history of the 1948 partition plan is going to override that emotional response. The information ecosystem has shifted from a curated narrative to a decentralized, algorithmic flood of imagery.
And there is a second layer to that digital shift, which is the way these platforms categorize information. We talked about this a bit in episode 743 when we discussed the fine line between criticism and anti-Semitism. On social media, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been successfully folded into the broader American domestic narrative of social justice and intersectionality. If you are a young person who views the world through the lens of power dynamics, where the world is divided into oppressors and the oppressed, Israel is almost always cast as the powerful colonial oppressor.
It is a very effective framing, even if it is historically complex. By framing Israel as a settler colonial project, activists have managed to link the Palestinian cause to every other social justice movement in the United States. It creates a sort of package deal for political identity. If you care about climate change, or racial justice, or labor rights, you are told that you must also hold this specific view of Israel. It is no longer an isolated foreign policy issue. It is a litmus test for being a good person in certain social circles. This is why the strategic ally argument falls on deaf ears. If you tell a 30-year-old voter that Israel is vital for American intelligence sharing, they see that as an excuse for what they perceive as human rights violations.
The language of realpolitik simply does not resonate with a generation that has been taught that morality is the only valid metric for international relations. And we have to be honest about the impact of the last 2 years of conflict. The Pew data shows that Israel's unfavorability in the United States jumped 11 percentage points between early 2022 and early 2025. That is a massive move in a very short period. The sustained intensity of the military operations, the high civilian death tolls reported in the media, and the lack of a clear political horizon have all combined to give critics a mountain of ammunition.
We also have to look at the shift in campus activism from 2010 to 2026. In 2010, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was a fringe element on most campuses. By 2026, it has become the dominant framework for student government and campus discourse. This isn't just about students. These students are now entering the workforce, the State Department, and newsrooms. They are bringing that intersectional lens with them. Herman, you were looking at how this fine line between policy criticism and anti-Semitism gets blurred in these spaces.
In episode 743, we explored how legitimate criticism of a government's actions can morph into something more exclusionary. In the current digital discourse, that line is often ignored entirely. Because the narrative is so polarized, any attempt to provide nuance or to mention Israeli security concerns is often labeled as apologism. This makes it very difficult for the traditional pro-Israel organizations to even get a seat at the table with younger demographics. They are speaking a language of security and history to a generation that only speaks the language of justice and equity.
It is a total decoupling. But let us move beyond the United States for a moment, because as bad as the numbers look in America, they are significantly worse in Western Europe. Herman, you were looking at the YouGov Eurotrack data from late 2025. What did that show regarding the global divergence?
It is pretty grim for the Israeli Diplomatic Corps, KORN. Net favorability for Israel has reached record lows in almost every major Western European country. We are talking about places like Britain, France, Germany, and Denmark. But the real outliers, the ones where the sentiment has turned most sharply hostile, are Spain and Ireland. In Spain, for example, 91% of people on the political left now hold a negative view of Israel. And across the general population in Spain and Italy, net favorability is in the negative 50s.
Ireland is another fascinating case. We actually did a whole episode on this recently, episode 979, about Ireland's institutional shift, but the public opinion there is almost unique in its intensity. There is this historical narrative in Ireland where they see their own history of British occupation mirrored in the Palestinian struggle. It is a very powerful, very emotional connection that has made Ireland perhaps the most vocally anti-Israel country in the European Union. And you see that manifesting in policy. Ireland, Spain, and Norway all moved to formally recognize a Palestinian state in the last couple of years.
This was a massive diplomatic blow because it signaled that the European consensus was breaking. For a long time, the European Union's position was that recognition should only come as the result of a negotiated two-state solution. By moving early, these countries basically said they no longer trust the negotiation process and want to impose a reality from the outside. However, we should contrast this with Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland and Hungary have remained much more supportive. In Poland, favorability remains relatively stable. Why? Because their information ecosystem is still heavily influenced by a fear of regional instability and a historical memory of what it means to have a hostile neighbor. They see Israel's security concerns through a much more sympathetic lens.
That is a great contrast. While Western Europe moves toward a human rights first approach, Eastern Europe still operates on a security first framework. But the most significant shift might be in the global south. If you look at the Pew survey of 24 countries from June 2025, the lowest favorability ratings were in Turkey at 93% negative and Indonesia at 80%. These are large, influential nations. But even in places like Brazil and South Africa, the narrative of settler colonialism has taken deep root.
The South African case is particularly important because of the legal dimension. We covered the Gaza genocide case in episode 710, and the impact of that legal challenge cannot be overstated. Even if the court did not reach a final verdict of genocide, the mere fact that the case was brought by South Africa, a nation that carries immense moral weight regarding the struggle against apartheid, provided a sort of legalistic veneer to the public's anger globally. It allowed people to say, it is not just my opinion, it is a matter of international law. This has effectively isolated Israel in international forums like the United Nations.
This is where the soft power war is being lost. Israel has always focused on state-to-state diplomacy and military strength, which are essential for survival. But in the 21st century, if you lose the battle of public opinion, you eventually lose the battle of political legitimacy. If the voters in your allied countries do not believe in your cause, eventually their politicians will find it too costly to support you. We are already seeing that with the debates over military aid in the United States Congress.
So, where is the hope? Because we promised to look for optimism, and it is not all bad news. There are still places where Israel's story is being heard or where the interests are aligned differently. The first place to look is Africa, specifically Kenya and Nigeria. In the 2025 Pew survey, these were the only two countries where a majority of the population held a favorable view of Israel. In Nigeria, it was 59% favorable. In Kenya, it was 50%.
Why there? Is it a religious connection, or is it something more practical?
It is a bit of both. There is a strong Christian population in both countries that feels a biblical connection to the land of Israel, but there is also a very practical security alignment. Both Kenya and Nigeria have struggled for years with Islamic extremist groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. They see Israel as a partner that understands the threat of radicalism and has the technology and intelligence to help them fight it. In those countries, Israel isn't seen as an oppressor. It's seen as a vital ally in a shared struggle for survival. This is a security-based favorability that bypasses the Western intersectional narrative.
And then we have to talk about the Abraham Accords. This is the biggest source of optimism for the long term. Despite all the conflict of the last 2 years, the Accords have held. If you look at the United Arab Emirates, the relationship has actually deepened. Trade between Israel and the United Arab Emirates surpassed $3 billion in 2025. There are daily flights between Tel Aviv and Dubai that are packed with entrepreneurs and tourists.
And the cultural shift in the Emirates is what really blows my mind. The Emirati government didn't just sign a treaty, they launched a massive internal campaign to change the narrative. They introduced Holocaust education into their schools. They promoted interfaith dialogue, and the results are showing up in the polling. While support for the Accords has dropped in places like Bahrain and Morocco due to the recent wars, the United Arab Emirates remains all in. A majority of Emirati youth under 30 now have a positive view of Jews and the State of Israel. That is a total transformation in just 5 years.
India is another one to watch. Prime Minister Modi has made the relationship with Israel a priority, and the Indian public increasingly sees Israel as a fellow democracy dealing with border security and radicalism. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, is a huge part of this. They see Israel as a vital link in their own economic future. When you add up India, the United Arab Emirates, and parts of Africa and Eastern Europe, you start to see a new map of Israeli influence that is much less dependent on the traditional Western European capitals.
It is a pivot to the east and the south. Israel is realizing that it can no longer rely on the soft power of the West, so it is building hard power alliances based on shared interests in technology, defense, and counterterrorism. It is a more cynical world in some ways, but it is also more realistic. But for our listeners, what are the practical takeaways? How should we process this data without getting lost in the noise?
First, I think we have to recognize that public opinion is not just a reflection of reality, it is a reflection of the information people consume. If you want to understand why people feel the way they do, you have to look at their feeds, not just the facts on the ground. We have to distinguish between state policy, historical context, and social media-driven sentiment. They are three different things, and they are often in direct conflict.
Second, we should stop expecting a return to the consensus of the 1990s. The demographic divide is too deep. The people who remember the era of the Oslo Accords or the Cold War are being replaced by a generation that views everything through the lens of identity politics. This means that anyone who cares about the United States-Israel relationship needs to find new ways to communicate that do not rely on the old scripts of the only democracy in the Middle East. That phrase just doesn't carry the weight it used to.
And third, we should keep an eye on the soft power deficit. Traditional public diplomacy, or Hasbara, is failing in the age of algorithmic content. You cannot explain away a visceral image with a press release. If Israel wants to regain favor in the West, it has to find a way to tell a story that resonates with the values of the under 55 demographic values, like human rights, transparency, and the protection of the marginalized. That is a tall order when you are also trying to maintain a high-intensity security state.
For those who want to track these trends more closely, I highly recommend diving into the Pew Research Center's Global Archives and the Gallup World Poll. They provide a level of granular detail that you just won't find in the headlines. Look at the longitudinal data, how the same questions are answered over 5 or 10 years. That is where you see the real tectonic shifts.
As we wrap up, we have to ask, what is the future of the United States-Israel relationship if the under 55 demographic becomes the dominant voting bloc in 10 or 15 years? It is likely to become more transactional, more conditional, and much more volatile. The days of bipartisan, unconditional support are likely over. We are watching the end of an era of consensus and the birth of something much more complex and contested.
Does public opinion still matter in a world of realpolitik? I would argue it matters more than ever. Politicians in a democracy can only ignore their base for so long. If the base moves, the policy eventually follows. Israel has a lot of work to do if it wants to build a new channel for its story in the West. But the success in the United Arab Emirates shows that it is possible to change hearts and minds, even in the most unlikely places, if the leadership is willing to lead.
Well said, Herman. This has been a heavy exploration, but a necessary one. Thanks to Daniel for the nudge to look into this 2026 data today. It has been a fascinating, if a bit sobering, deep dive into the shifting sands of global opinion.
If you have been enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation.
It really does. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we referenced today on the Gaza genocide case and the fine line of anti-Semitism, at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have an archive of over 900 episodes there.
Until next time, I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. We will see you in the next one.
Take care, everyone.
You know, Herman, I was just thinking about that Gallup parity point again. 41% for Palestinians and 36% for Israelis. If you had told someone that in the year 2000, they would have thought you were talking about a different planet.
It shows just how much the cultural landscape has changed. It is not just about the conflict itself, it is about the entire moral framework of the West shifting beneath our feet.
And that is exactly why we do this show, to try and make sense of those shifts before they completely reshape our world.
Well, we certainly did that today.
We did. All right, for real this time, thanks for listening.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Find us on Spotify and at myweirdprompts.com.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
One last thing, Herman. I think we should mention that the Pew data also showed a split within the Republican Party for the first time. Republicans under 50 are now about as likely to have a negative view of Israel as a positive one. That is a massive change from 2022, when they were 63% positive.
That is actually a critical point, Corn. It means the erosion isn't just happening on the left, it is happening across the board among younger people. If even the conservative base is starting to fracture, the long-term political support for Israel in the United States is on much shakier ground than most people realize.
It really is. It is a generational divide that transcends party lines.
Which makes it even more important to understand the drivers behind it.
Okay, now we are definitely done.
See you in episode 967.
Can't wait.
Bye.
You know, Herman, as we were talking, I realized we didn't spend much time on the impact of the Gaza genocide case on the global south. We mentioned it, but the second-order effect there is that it has given countries like Brazil and Indonesia a moral high ground they didn't have before.
That is true. It has essentially globalized the Palestinian cause in a way that makes it a proxy for the entire global South's grievances against the West. Israel is being caught in the crossfire of a much larger struggle for global influence.
It is the ultimate intersectional issue, but on a global scale.
And that is why the diplomatic pivot we discussed is so necessary. Israel has to find a way to speak to that world, not just the West.
Well, that is a topic for a whole other episode.
Probably several episodes.
Agreed. All right, thanks again, everyone.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
Signing off. Herman, I just realized we should probably clarify that the Pew survey we cited was the one from June 2025, covering 24 countries. It is important for our listeners to know the scale of that study. Over 28,000 adults.
Good point. It is one of the most comprehensive looks at global opinion ever conducted on this topic. It is not just a small sample, it is a massive data set.
Which makes the findings all the more significant.
Definitely.
Okay, I think we have truly covered it now.
I think so too.
See you later, Herman.
See you, Corn.
And thanks to everyone for sticking with us through this deep dive. We know it was a long one, but some topics just demand that kind of space.
We hope you found it as enlightening as we did.
Until next time.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
You know, I just thought of one more thing.
Oh boy, here we go.
No, it is just a quick one. We talked about the TikTok effect, but we didn't mention that the Israeli government has actually started trying to compete on those platforms more aggressively in the last few months.
That is true. They are trying to use influencers and short-form video to tell their side of the story.
But is it working? Or is it just seen as more propaganda?
It is a struggle. When you are the state, it is very hard to come across as authentic on a platform that values raw individual voices.
That is the paradox of modern soft power. The more you try to control the narrative, the less people trust it. All right, now I am really done.
I will believe it when I see the recording stop.
Fair enough. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Herman, I just had one more thought about the polling in India.
Corn, we have to stop eventually.
I know. But the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC, is a huge part of why India's public opinion is shifting. They see Israel as a vital link in their own economic future.
You are right. It is the perfect example of realpolitik driving public sentiment. When people see that a relationship is good for their own wallets and their own country's status, they tend to view that partner more favorably.
It is the most powerful antidote to the ideological shifts we are seeing in the West.
It really is.
Okay, that is my final point.
I believe you.
Good. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
Find us on Spotify.
And at myweirdprompts.com.
Thanks again.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you in the next episode.
Can't wait.
Me neither.
Bye.
Bye.
This is getting ridiculous.
I know, but there is just so much to say.
We will save the rest for the next 900 episodes.
Deal.
All right. See you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This has been My Weird Prompts,
A human AI collaboration
hosted by the Poppleberry Brothers.
in Jerusalem.
Thanks for joining us.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, I'm leaving now.
Me too.
Hotoy.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.